I'm going to introduce our first speaker of this session, so Petra Molnar, who is at Toronto University, or University of Toronto, but also split with Cambridge University in the UK, which I think is a very good thing given the initiative and the collaboration that we're trying to further here. So yeah, I'll leave it to you, Petra.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you to all of you for coming and staying awake at this time of day. So I will try and make it as lively as possible. So my name is Petra, and I'm a human rights lawyer and a refugee lawyer. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is a report that I worked on with the University of Toronto International Human Rights Clinic and the Citizen Lab. Essentially trying to tease apart some of these ideas, not just about ethics, but also about the human rights implications of using new technologies in immigration and refugee decision-making. I'm going to focus mostly on Canada because that's what the report was about, but I will also draw on some of my more recent work, looking at how these technologies of what we sometimes call migration management, how they're being used across various jurisdictions and what some of the human rights implications might be. So just a little bit about us. So the IHRP, the International Human Rights Clinic, is a very small team of 3 people, and we try and introduce international human rights frameworks into emerging areas. Technology is a new area for us, and I do not pretend to be a technologist. I am, at heart, a refugee and immigration lawyer. So unfortunately, my co-author, Lex Gill, was not able to participate in any of the advocacy around this report because her current place of work does not permit that. So I do apologize if some of my technical knowledge is not up to par with the rest of the room. But what I hope to do instead is to tease out and problematize some of these areas around human rights. What we try to do in our work is kind of look at how human rights, migration, and technology intersect, and particularly how technology is experienced differently by different groups. And this has been something that we've, I think, been talking a lot about today, how the context matters when it comes to the development and deployment of technology. And really what I try and do in my work now is to have proactive conversations around what human rights impacts might look like down the line. So just some foundational ideas. We are talking about automated decision-making systems, which of course is a very broad term, and it can refer, in our report, we refer to it as a class of technologies that either assist or replace the judgment of human decision makers. And they are very emerging, but it is all about the augmentation of human judgment. Now, I know for those of you who are well steeped into this discipline, this is a very broad definition, but we made it broad precisely because we wanted to encapsulate as many of these systems as possible. So there's really 6 kind of main takeaway points. These technologies are already in use and in development, both within Canada but also internationally. The sheer scale of impact is quite extraordinary because we're talking about potentially millions of different applications that might be impacted. A lot of people are on the move these days, both within and outside of Canada. The risks to human lives and human rights are real. We don't mean to fearmonger, because that really doesn't further the conversation at all, but instead it's important to tease apart some of these ideas, particularly around the differential experiences around technology that groups such as migrants and refugees might experience. Immigration law in particular is a really fascinating lens through which to examine some of these technologies, because we're really dealing with a discretionary, opaque system of decision-making with weaker safeguards and oversights than some other areas of law. And there's often also a kind of this practical and legal nexus between immigration law and national security. Now, given the time that I have, I'm not sure if we'll be able to get into this, but maybe we can have a conversation around this afterwards. And most importantly, human migration is incredibly complex. We're dealing with really difficult, often intractable problems that we've been grappling with for decades, if not centuries. And the worry sometimes is that using this AI hype or techno-solutionism doesn't really get at some of these underlying ideas that we need to have as a society about who has access to rights or mechanisms of redress. So very briefly, in our report, and I can make that available to you, we took a look at the way that the Canadian immigration system operates and some of the ways that this technology might be used in the future. Again, the idea was to be as proactive as possible and think through current and future uses of this technology. And especially when you look at it from a cross-jurisdictional perspective, there are countries already that are experimenting with different uses of new technology at all the different points within a person's experience within an immigration system. So that might be pre-arrival, before you actually get into a country. That might be at the border, how you interact with a border official, or even an AI lie detector, which we can unpack a little bit. In country, that can mean your experiences being an immigration detainee, for example. And then leaving Canada when you've exhausted all your legal options and are being asked to leave, for example. What will that look like when we're using these new technologies? A little bit about the Canadian context, and I should also point out we do have the Immigration Department representatives here in the room as well. They are much better versed, I think, in terms of being able to speak to some of these issues. Again, I'm here more to present some of these normative ideas around how we think human rights should be at the center of these conversations. But we know that there has been some work done on predictive analytics within the Canadian space. And there's also emerging policy engagement and standard setting that is going on, I think, across the board as the Canadian government, but also specifically within immigration. But these intersections between immigration law domestically and internationally are really fascinating, because inherently immigration law is a transnational global phenomenon. So it's not just within Canada. We also have to kind of blow out the conversation and think about how this is being thought about internationally. What I would like to focus the majority of my discussion on today is the human rights impacts of this technology. And in our report, we go through this thought exercise looking at international legal instruments as well as domestic obligations under the Canadian Charter, and highlight how new technologies will impact rights such as freedom of association, freedom of religion and expression, obviously freedom of movement, and even life, liberty, and security of the person. For example, if you have an algorithm that's being used to determine whether somebody should be put into immigration detention, as has been done at the US-Mexico border. But what I would like to focus on specifically is equality and freedom from discrimination, and then I'll touch on a little bit on privacy rights, just to pick up on some of the threads that we've been discussing as a group today. So particularly, I think what is clear is that when we're looking at the potential of equality and discrimination in this context, the context really matters, because we are looking at a group, whether you're thinking of immigrants or refugees, that have a very unique experience when they move through a legal system. So we already know that AI has a particularly problematic track record when it comes to race and gender, for example. So just to tease this out a little bit further, we know that there was an algorithm that was being experimented with in the United States to try and predict someone's sexual orientation. What would that look like if this algorithm was brought into refugee or immigration decision-making? We have to think about the ramifications, particularly in a particular context, and how this information might be shared or how it might impact decision-making for someone who's going through the immigration system. I will go back to that example of the AI lie detector. So this is something that I came across fairly recently, and this is a pilot project that's being introduced in the European Union at particular airports in Hungary and Croatia and Greece, where they're thinking through, like, how can we make the system of crossing a border more efficient? And it's this new idea of trying to use a lie detector that will either stream you as someone who says, truthful things, and then you can cross into the border, or you will be streamed into meeting with an immigration official. It seems innocuous, but for me as a refugee lawyer, I immediately start thinking about, again, the context of the application of this technology. How will this AI lie detector be able to deal with issues around cross-cultural communication differences, which is something that was already mentioned by some of our colleagues? Or what about the fact that we know that trauma impacts memory and a person's ability to communicate in a clear way, or even in a way that's maybe not in accordance with our own ideas about plausibility from a Western lens? I know that these questions might seem a bit far-fetched, but I think it's important to really interrogate what this is going to look like if we're experimenting with the use of these new technologies in a space that's opaque and discretionary, like border decision-making. Privacy, again, has to be thought of in a contextual way. And there is some international legal jurisprudence that already exists that says and recognizes that refugees and migrants have a differential right to privacy, because privacy breaches can have real wide ramifications for this particular group. Again, data sharing across different jurisdictions is something to think about. Because if we are collecting vast amounts of data through these technologies, how will we ensure that they are not then shared with governments where somebody might be getting deported to, for example? I think you're getting the sense that there are more questions than answers in a lot of this work. So, of course, there is this tension that we need to think about. How do we maximize the person's ability to also have full and meaningful participation in the system, which is something that we've also talked about. I was going to bring this up later, but perhaps now is the time. It's also interesting because we have to unpack some of these ideas around informed consent. So we know that there is an increasing, what some other scholars have called, datification of humanitarian responses. So to try and, for example, preemptively analyze where a conflict might break out, big data analytics are increasingly being used to do that. Or in the case of efficient resources and service provision in contexts such as refugee camps, biometrics are increasingly being used. But what will it mean to actually be able to say, no, I don't want to participate in this data collection or in this biometric system? So in the Azraq refugee camp in Jordan, where I was a few years ago, it came to light that biometrics are increasingly being used to augment the collection of data and also to replace cash cards that you would use to collect your weekly food rations. So now instead of a cash card, we are relying on iris scanning. So that seems okay, that's a good thing. We will have maybe a more stable source of identity for people who don't have identity documents. But how do people actually feel about having their irises scanned in exchange for food? And IRIN did a really interesting investigation in 2016 that profiled a lot of the refugees in Azraq, and the vast majority of them interviewed said that they were not comfortable to have their irises scanned, partly also because they didn't know where this information was going and what it meant to actually opt out of the system. If you don't have your iris scanned, you don't eat. Is that really informed consent? These are all kind of questions I think that we have to tease apart. Really, in practice, all of these rights intersect, and it's becoming very clear that from a global governance perspective, we really need to have a conversation across sectors to think about how we're going to regulate the use of this technology, particularly in this opaque space of migration management or immigration decision-making. One other thing for the legal eagles in the room, we did also think through issues around administrative law, particularly procedural fairness, again, meaningful informed consent, things like that, and standard of review. What would review really look like in this context? And not to get too legally, perhaps we can look at it from a normative perspective instead. Even questions around what constitutes a decision maker is something that's important to unpack. So if, for example, you get wrongfully deported based on an algorithm, which actually already happened in UK, and you want to challenge that decision, who are you actually challenging, right? And then it also gets at these really broader questions around should algorithms or will algorithms at one point have legal personality that we can challenge in court? These are maybe futuristic questions, but I don't think they're as far-fetched as we think they are. And take it from someone who is not a technologist, who is a refugee lawyer, right? Like, these are questions that now we are talking about with colleagues because a lot of people are starting to think, maybe this is the new frontier of legal a liability that we need to think about. There's also other systemic challenges that maybe we can also unpack. One thing I would like to mention, which we've already talked about, is private sector accountability, because a lot of this technology has to be developed in the private sector. But of course, there's an independent responsibility of the private sector to ensure that technologies are rights respecting. And they have clear obligations under domestic and international law, but there is this slippage because we're, of course, getting around these ideas of proprietary laws and IP, and what is that going to look like when we're taking technologies developed in the private sector and importing them into the public sector. Access to justice is a big one. Who does technology actually benefit, and who can meaningfully participate in the development of these new technologies? Will these technologies exacerbate existing barriers that we have in society, or will they allow us to think through new ways of how to create a more fair and democratic world? Public confidence is a big one as well. How does the public think about bias and the administration of justice when we're using these new technologies? And what can we do to increase public confidence in the use of this new technology if this is where we're heading? And global impacts are important because, again, this is, I think, what's fascinating about thinking through immigration and technology together, because there is this similarity between them, I think. They both are global and they both travel across jurisdictional boundaries very easily. So what do we do as a global community to think about which communities we experiment on, which ones have access to rights and redress, and how can we have a democratic conversation with everybody at the table? So what I try and do is tease apart some of these ideas around consent, around differential ways that power is distributed in society, and how technology often does exacerbate this inequality that already exists. And that's why these cross-sectoral conversations are very important. We need to have policymakers, lawyers who look at things from an immigration but also from a human rights perspective, technologists, engineers, educators, but then also affected communities. We need to all be brought to the table so that we can discuss how we want to move forward with the use of this new technology. Because ultimately, these broad questions around the societal use of the technology, I think, really matters. Because it's very clear that different groups benefit differently. And who gets to decide how this technology is developed? So I think I'll stop it there so that we can perhaps have some time for questions. Thank you so much for inviting me today, and I look forward to your comments. Thanks.